While I was recovering from spinal surgery, my husband George drained our life savings and maxed out every credit card we had. Belle won't be walking again anyway, he whispered to his brother on the phone. Might as well enjoy the money while we can. What he didn't know was that my great-aunt's $800 million inheritance had just cleared into my personal account that morning, and I was about to turn his greed into the biggest mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morphine was wearing off when I heard George's voice drifting through the partially open door of my hospital room. My spine felt like it had been reconstructed with railroad spikes, and my legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. 3 months since the accident that had crushed 2 vertebrae and left me fighting to walk again, and I was finally coherent enough to understand conversations around me. "Kirk, you should see the bills piling up," George was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "Physical therapy, specialized equipment, modifications to the house. It's going to bankrupt us." My brother-in-law Kirk's response was muffled, but I caught enough words to understand they were discussing my medical expenses. Nothing unusual there. We'd talked openly about the financial strain my recovery was causing. George had been so supportive, so dedicated during these months. He'd even taken early retirement from his position as a bank manager to care for me full-time. "The thing is," George continued, and something in his tone made me focus despite the fog of pain medication, "the doctors aren't optimistic about her mobility returning. She's probably going to need care for the rest of her life." I wanted to call out, to remind him that Dr. Patterson had actually been encouraged by my progress just yesterday. My sensation was returning faster than expected, and there were signs that I might regain significant function with continued therapy. But my throat felt like sandpaper, and the effort to speak seemed monumental. "Belle won't be walking again anyway." George's voice dropped to what he probably thought was a whisper. "Might as well enjoy the money while we can. I've got access to everything now. The joint accounts, the credit cards, even her retirement fund." She signed the power of attorney papers right after surgery when she was barely conscious. The words hit me like a physical blow, more painful than any of the surgical procedures I'd endured. I remembered signing papers in a haze of post-operative confusion, trusting George completely when he'd explained they were just routine medical authorizations. He'd held my hand, told me everything would be fine, that he'd take care of everything. "How much are we talking about?" Kirk's voice was clearer now, tinged with what sounded like excitement. "Well, she had about 60,000 in savings, maybe 40 in checking. The retirement account has about 200,000. But here's the beautiful part. She's got these credit cards with huge limits because of her credit score. I've already moved about 30,000 through cash advances, and I'm just getting started." My heart monitor must have detected my distress because it began beeping more rapidly. George's conversation stopped abruptly. "Someone's coming," he hissed. "I'll call you back tonight. Meet me at Rosario's at 8. I want to show you something." I forced my breathing to slow, my eyes to remain closed as George stepped back into the room. I felt his presence beside my bed, and then his hand touched my forehead with what anyone watching would interpret as loving concern. "How's my beautiful wife doing?" he said softly, his voice carrying all the warmth and devotion it had held for the past 8 years of our marriage. "The nurses say you're doing better today. I've been handling all the insurance paperwork. Don't you worry about anything." If I hadn't just heard his conversation, I would have found his words comforting. Instead, they made my skin crawl. Every gentle touch, every reassuring word now felt like a performance designed to keep me compliant, while he systematically stole everything we'd built together. A nurse entered. Her badge read Dorothy Santos, and George immediately shifted into the role of devoted husband. "She seems more alert today," he told Dorothy, squeezing my hand. Her eyes were tracking movement earlier. That's wonderful news, Dorothy replied, checking my chart. Dr. Patterson wants to try reducing her pain medication gradually. The less sedated she is, the better her chances for neural recovery. Whatever's best for Belle, George said, his voice thick with fake emotion. I just want my wife back. After Dorothy left and George excused himself to grab some coffee, I lay in the growing darkness of my hospital room, trying to process what I'd learned. My husband of 8 years, the man I'd trusted with my life, my recovery, my future, was systematically draining our accounts because he believed I'd never walk again. But there was something George didn't know, something that would change everything. 3 days ago, while he'd been in the cafeteria during one of his breaks from his devoted husband act, I'd received a visit from Annette Morrison, a lawyer I'd never met before. She'd explained that my great-aunt Millicent, whom I'd only met twice in my childhood, had passed away 6 months ago. The family had been trying to locate me, but my married name and change of address had delayed the process. Aunt Millicent, it turned out, had been far wealthier than anyone in the family had realized. She'd built a quiet fortune through decades of strategic investments, real estate acquisitions, and a small technology company she'd founded in the 1990s that had eventually been acquired by a major corporation for an astronomical sum. Having never married and with no children, she'd left her entire estate to her most sensible great-niece, me. Annetta had presented documents showing that I was the sole heir to $847 million. The irony was almost laughable. While George was congratulating himself on stealing our modest life savings and running up credit card debt, thinking he was outsmarting his disabled wife, nearly $1 billion had been sitting in a trust account waiting for the probate process to complete. Annetta had explained that the inheritance would transfer to my personal account, not the joint accounts George had access to, once the final legal requirements were met. She'd estimated it would happen within days, and this morning, just hours before I'd overheard George's conversation with Kirk, my phone had buzzed with a banking notification. Even through my medication haze, I'd recognized the importance of the alert. The inheritance had cleared $847,455.78, now sat in my personal checking account. George thought he was married to a disabled woman whose modest savings he could steal, with impunity. What he'd actually married was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the country, and she'd just discovered exactly what kind of man he really was. As I lay in my hospital bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, shift beginning their rounds, I began to plan. George had underestimated me in every possible way. My recovery prospects, my awareness of his theft, and most critically, my resources. He was about to learn that stealing from a helpless patient was bad enough, but stealing from someone with nearly $1 billion and the motivation to seek justice, that was a mistake that would cost him everything. The quiet accountant he'd married was gone. In her place was someone with unlimited resources, growing physical strength, and absolutely nothing left to lose. George wanted to enjoy stolen money while he could. I was about to show him how expensive that enjoyment could become. Over the next 48 hours, my world shifted in ways that had nothing to do with my physical recovery. The pain medication was being reduced according to Dr. Patterson's orders, which meant my mind was becoming clearer while my body reminded me constantly of its limitations. I could move my toes now, a victory that should have filled me with joy. Instead, every small improvement felt like ammunition I was gathering for a war I hadn't chosen, but was definitely going to win. George maintained his performance flawlessly. He arrived each morning at 8:30 with coffee and whatever breakfast. He'd picked up from the hospital cafeteria, settling into the chair beside my bed with the dedication of a man whose world revolved around his wife's recovery. He read to me from books I'd loved, played soft music from his phone, and updated me on cards and flowers from friends. "Blanche from your old office sent another arrangement," he said on Thursday morning, gesturing toward a modest bouquet near the window. She says everyone misses you and can't wait for you to get back on your feet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Blanche Mackenzie had been my supervisor at Sterling Financial Services before George convinced me to take early retirement 2 years ago. At the time, he'd argued that my stress levels were too high, that we could afford for me to step back and focus on other things. Now I wondered if he'd been calculating even then, reducing my financial independence in preparation for this moment. Doctor, Patterson seems optimistic about your progress, George continued, squeezing my hand. He said the nerve response tests show real improvement. You might be home sooner than we thought. Home. The word that should have comforted me now felt like a threat. What modifications had he supposedly made to our house? What equipment had he purchased with our drained accounts? Or was he simply planning to keep me isolated there while he continued his theft? I was beginning to understand that my accident hadn't created this situation. It had simply revealed it. George's willingness to steal from his disabled wife suggested a capacity for deception that had probably existed long before my surgery. How many other lies had I accepted without question during our marriage? That afternoon, while George was meeting with my physical therapist about home care requirements, Dorothy Santos entered with my daily medications. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who'd been nursing for decades. "You're looking more alert today, Belle," she observed, checking my chart. "Your husband mentioned you were tracking movement better yesterday." I managed to croak out my first coherent words in days. "Water?" Dorothy's face lit up. "Of course. This is wonderful. Dr. Patterson will be so pleased you're starting to vocalize again." As she helped me sip water through a straw, I seized the opportunity. "Dorothy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I need help." She leaned closer, concern creasing her features. "What kind of help, honey? Are you in pain?" "Not physical." I struggled to form the words clearly. "My husband." "Something's wrong." Dorothy's expression shifted to one of professional caution. She'd probably heard confused or paranoid statements from patients on pain medication before. "What do you mean, Belle?" "He's taking money. Heard him. On phone." "Sometimes patients on medication can misinterpret conversations," Dorothy said, gently. "Your husband has been incredibly devoted. He's here 12 hours a day, managing all your care coordination." I closed my eyes, frustrated by my physical limitations and the fog still affecting my speech. How could I explain that George's devotion was actually a cover for systematic theft? That his constant presence wasn't love but surveillance? "Bank statements," I managed. "Can you get them?" Dorothy hesitated. "Belle, I can't access your personal financial information. That's something you'd need to discuss with your husband or handle yourself when you're feeling stronger." But something in her expression suggested she was taking my concern more seriously than her words indicated. She'd been around long enough to know that domestic abuse and financial exploitation often escalated when victims became vulnerable. "Your phone?" I asked hopefully. "Hospital policy doesn't allow patients to use personal phones during certain recovery phases," Dorothy explained. "But Dr. Patterson might clear you for limited communication soon." After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling, calculating my limited options. I needed to access my bank accounts, but George controlled my phone, my laptop, and apparently all our financial information. The inheritance account was separate, but I needed to understand the full scope of what he'd stolen from our joint assets. More importantly, I needed to start documenting his behavior. If George was willing to steal from his disabled wife, he was certainly capable of other forms of deception or manipulation. I needed evidence before I made any moves. That evening, George returned from his dinner break with unusual energy. He seemed almost excited as he settled into his usual chair. "I've been thinking about when you come home," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that now sounded calculated to my ears. "We might need to consider some lifestyle changes. Simplify things. Maybe sell the house and find something more manageable. Sell the house." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Our home was worth nearly $400,000, and my name was on the deed. With power of attorney, George could potentially force a sale and pocket the proceeds under the guise of paying for my care. "The equity could help with your medical expenses," he continued, stroking my hand. "And we could find a nice single-story place, maybe closer to the city where you'd have better access to specialists." I made a sound that he interpreted as agreement, but internally I was adding real estate fraud to the growing list of crimes he was contemplating. George wasn't just stealing our current assets. He was planning to liquidate everything we owned. "Oscar Chen from the bank stopped by today," George mentioned casually. "He wanted to check on you, and we discussed some options for restructuring our accounts to better handle your care costs." Oscar Chen was the senior loan officer at George's former bank, someone who would have access to our financial information and the authority to approve large transactions. If George was involving him in restructuring, it suggested the theft was becoming more sophisticated and potentially involving conspiracy. As visiting hours ended and George prepared to leave for the night, he kissed my forehead with what anyone watching would see as tenderness. "Sleep well, beautiful," he whispered. "Tomorrow's going to be a better day. I can feel it." After he left, I lay in the darkened room listening to the sounds of the night shift beginning their rounds. George was right about tomorrow being different, but not in the way he expected. With nearly $1 billion at my disposal and a growing understanding of his betrayal, I was about to become very dangerous indeed. My physical recovery was progressing faster than anyone expected. My financial resources were beyond anything George could imagine, and my motivation to seek justice was becoming the strongest force in my healing process. George thought he was managing a helpless victim whose assets he could steal with impunity. He was actually orchestrating his own destruction, one stolen dollar at a time. The confirmation came on Friday morning, delivered not by George's careless words, but by his deliberate lies. Dr. Patterson arrived for his rounds earlier than usual, his expression carrying the kind of cautious optimism I'd learned to recognize during my weeks of recovery. "Mrs. Harrison, this is remarkable progress," he said after completing his neurological examination. "Your reflexes are responding beautifully, and the sensory tests show significant improvement. I'm actually considering moving up your discharge timeline." I felt a surge of genuine hope for the first time since my accident. My legs were responding to stimulation, my coordination was improving daily, and the possibility of walking again, really walking, was becoming more realistic. "However," Dr. Patterson continued, consulting his tablet, "your husband expressed some concerns yesterday about your readiness for home care. He mentioned you've been experiencing confusion, possibly some paranoid thoughts." The hope curdled in my stomach. George had been preparing for this moment, laying groundwork to discredit anything I might say about his theft. If he could convince my medical team that I was mentally unstable, it would be much easier to maintain control over my finances and medical decisions. Mr. Harrison suggested we might want to consider extended care options, Dr. Patterson said, carefully. "He seems to feel that your home environment might not be suitable for your recovery needs. Extended care, a nursing facility where George could park me indefinitely while he liquidated our assets, where my communication with the outside world would be limited and monitored, where his power of attorney would give him complete control over my life." "I feel clear," I managed to say, though my voice was still weak. "Mind is good." Dr. Patterson nodded encouragingly. "Your speech is definitely improving. Let's continue with the current treatment plan and reassess in a few days." After he left, I lay staring at the ceiling, understanding finally that I was in a race against time. George wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically destroying my ability to fight back. If I ended up in extended care under his guardianship, the inheritance would be meaningless. He'd find ways to access it eventually, and I'd be powerless to stop him. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Annette Morrison, the estate lawyer, appeared in my doorway carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression of professional concern. "Belle, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, settling into the chair George usually occupied. "I wanted to check on your recovery and discuss some details about your inheritance." I struggled to sit up straighter, my heart racing with anticipation and fear. "George isn't here right now. Actually, that might be for the best," Annette said, her tone suggesting she had concerns. "I've been trying to reach you directly, but your husband has been very protective of your communication. He told me you weren't ready for complex financial discussions yet." Another lie. Another attempt to isolate me from resources that could threaten his control. "I'm ready," I said, forcing my words to be as clear as possible. "Tell me everything." Annette pulled out a thick folder. "The inheritance has been fully processed and transferred to your personal account at Meridian Bank, the account your husband doesn't have access to. The total amount is $847,362,455.78. Hearing the number spoken aloud made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. I was worth nearly $1 billion, while my husband was stealing our grocery money and maxing out credit cards. "There are some complexities we need to discuss," Annetta continued. "The estate included not just liquid assets, but also real estate holdings, stock portfolios, and controlling interests in several companies. You'll need to make decisions about management of these assets." "George doesn't know," I said quietly. Annette's expression grew sharp. "About the inheritance?" "No, I haven't discussed it with him. The estate specifically designated you as the sole beneficiary, and all communications were directed to be with you personally." "He's stealing," I whispered, glancing toward the door. "Our money, credit cards, planning to sell our house." Annette leaned forward, her professional demeanor shifting to one of intense focus. "Belle, are you saying your husband is committing financial fraud?" I nodded, tears starting to flow. "Heard him on phone. Says I won't walk again. Taking everything while I can't stop him." "This is very serious," Annette said, pulling out her phone. "Financial abuse of a vulnerable adult is a felony, and if he's using forged power of attorney documents—" "He made me sign papers," I said. "After surgery. I was confused, on medication. Thought they were medical forms." Annetta's face hardened. "Belle, with your permission, I'd like to bring in some additional help. I know attorneys who specialize in financial crimes, and we can also involve adult protective services if necessary." For the first time since overhearing George's conversation, I felt a spark of real hope. I wasn't helpless. I had resources, not just the inheritance, but professional allies who could help me fight back. "Yes," I said firmly, "help me." Annette made several calls, speaking in low tones about emergency protective measures and suspected financial abuse. When she finished, she turned back to me with a determined expression. "Belle, we're going to document everything. I'm arranging for a forensic accountant to examine your joint accounts and credit reports. We'll also need medical testimony about your mental competency to challenge any documents you signed under duress." "George will find out," I worried. "Not immediately," Annette assured me. "We'll work quietly at first, gathering evidence. The inheritance account is completely separate and secure. He can't access it or even know it exists unless you tell him." That evening, when George returned from what he claimed was a meeting with our insurance company, his demeanor was different. He seemed nervous, frequently checking his phone and avoiding eye contact. "How was your day, beautiful?" he asked, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Better," I said simply. "Dr. Patterson says I'm improving faster than expected." Something. flickered across George's face. Disappointment? Concern? That's wonderful news, of course. Though we should be realistic about your limitations going forward. What did insurance say? I asked, testing him. Oh, the usual bureaucracy, he said vaguely. Lots of paperwork, coverage questions, nothing for you to worry about. I was beginning to understand George's tells, the way he touched his collar when lying, how his voice became slightly higher when he was nervous. These were probably behaviors I'd noticed subconsciously throughout our marriage, but had never recognized as deception. Kirk stopped by the house today, George mentioned casually. He helped me move some things around, clear space for when you come home. Clear space, or remove valuable items before I could inventory what was missing. That was nice of him, I said. George nodded, but he was still checking his phone obsessively. Belle, I've been thinking about what's best for your recovery. There's a really excellent rehabilitation facility about an hour from here. Much better equipped than anything we could set up at home. There it was, the extended care facility he'd discussed with Dr. Patterson, his plan to warehouse me while he completed his theft. I want to go home, I said firmly. Of course you do, George said quickly. But we need to think about what's practical. The physical therapy requirements, the medical equipment, the round-the-clock care you'll need. I'm getting stronger. Every day. Yes. But the doctors say it could be months before you're truly independent again. If ever. That wasn't what Dr. Patterson had told me, but George didn't know I was lucid enough to contradict him. As he settled in for his evening vigil, playing soft music and reading from a book I'd once loved, I felt a cold satisfaction settling over me. George thought he was managing a helpless victim whose modest assets he could steal while planning her permanent institutionalization. He was actually sitting beside someone with nearly $1 billion, a growing network of professional allies, and a very clear understanding of exactly what kind of man she'd married. The devoted husband act was about to become very expensive for him indeed. The evidence arrived on Saturday morning disguised as flowers. Dorothy Santos entered my room carrying a large arrangement of white lilies, her expression carefully neutral as she placed them on the windowsill beside the other bouquets. From your friend Blanche at Sterling Financial, Dorothy said, loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. Then, moving closer to adjust my pillows, she whispered, "Check the card holder when you're alone." My heart raced as I waited for George to leave for his lunch break. He'd been more attentive than usual, barely leaving my side except for essential errands. His nervous energy from yesterday had intensified, and he kept checking his phone with increasing frequency. "I'll be back in an hour," he said, kissing my forehead. "The cafeteria is serving that soup you used to like." The moment his footsteps faded down the corridor, I struggled to reach the flower arrangement. Hidden behind the card was a small envelope marked with just my initials. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a tiny USB drive. The note was in Blanche's familiar handwriting. "Belle, Dorothy contacted me through mutual friends. I've been tracking some unusual activity. The USB contains bank statements and credit reports we pulled through legitimate channels. You need to see this. Trust Dorothy. B." My hands shook as I hid the USB drive in the waistband of my hospital gown. Blanche Mackenzie had been more than my supervisor at Sterling Financial. She'd been my mentor, teaching me to spot financial irregularities and fraudulent patterns. If she was concerned enough to risk her professional reputation by helping me access financial records, the situation was worse than I'd imagined. Dorothy returned 20 minutes later with my afternoon medications. "Pain level today?" she asked professionally. "Better," I replied, then lowered my voice. "How?" "Blanche is married to my cousin Miguel," Dorothy explained quietly. "When you mentioned bank statements yesterday, I remembered her talking about a former employee who'd taken early retirement. Small world, apparently." "What did she find?" Dorothy glanced toward the door, then pulled out her personal tablet. She couldn't tell me details over the phone, but she said the pattern of transactions on your accounts was extremely concerning. She's seen similar cases in corporate fraud investigations. The USB drive felt like it was burning against my skin. I need to see. I've been thinking about that, Dorothy said. There's a computer in the family consultation room that patients' relatives use to research medical information. It's private, and if we say you need to review insurance documentation... When? George. Just left. My shift supervisor is at lunch. Now would be perfect, but you'd need to get there yourself. Can you manage a wheelchair? My legs were responding better each day, and I'd been practicing transfers during my physical therapy sessions. I think so. Dorothy helped me into a wheelchair, arranging blankets to hide the extent of my mobility. We moved slowly down the corridor, Dorothy maintaining a professional demeanor as she explained to anyone who asked that we were reviewing insurance requirements. The consultation room was small and private with a computer terminal that Dorothy logged into using her credentials. I'll watch the door, she said. You have maybe 20 minutes before George returns. I inserted the USB drive with trembling fingers. The files that appeared on screen made my stomach lurch. Blanche had accessed 3 months of transaction history, from our joint checking and savings accounts, plus credit reports for both George and myself. The pattern that emerged was devastating in its systematic precision. The theft had begun exactly 2 weeks after my accident, starting small with $500 cash withdrawals that gradually increased in frequency and amount. George had been careful, at first, taking amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic fraud alerts, spacing transactions across different ATMs and branches. But as my recovery stretched longer than expected, his confidence had grown. In the past month alone, he'd drained $47,000 from our savings account through a series of wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Our checking account showed overdraft fees from purchases I couldn't identify, expensive dinners, hotel stays, and cash advances that totaled nearly $15,000. The credit card statements were worse. George had systematically maxed out every card we owned, plus applied for new ones using the power of attorney documents. The total debt he'd accumulated in my name was approaching $80,000, but the most chilling discovery was a series of emails. Blanche had somehow accessed through George's careless security practices. Messages to Kirk revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. The house appraisal came back at $420K. Once I get her into extended care, we can force the sale for medical expenses. Split should be enough to pay off the cards and leave us with about $200K each. Insurance payout might take longer than expected. She's recovering faster than the doctors initially thought. Might need to adjust timeline. Found another facility in Arizona, further from her friends, better for long-term management. They specialize in cognitive impairment cases. Easier to maintain guardianship. I sat staring at the screen, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. George hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized permanently. The theft was just the beginning of a scheme to take complete control of my life. Belle? Dorothy's voice was urgent from the doorway. He's coming back. We need to go. I quickly copied the files to a new folder on the desktop, labeling it with an innocuous name, then ejected the USB drive. Dorothy helped me back into the wheelchair, and we returned to my room just as George's voice echoed down the hallway. "How's my beautiful wife?" he asked as he entered, carrying a cup of soup that smelled nothing like what I used to enjoy. "I brought you lunch." "Thank you," I managed, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. As George fed me soup and chatted about his morning errands, I studied his face with new eyes. Every smile was calculated. Every gentle touch was performance. Every concerned comment about my recovery was actually frustration that I was healing too quickly for his plans. "I spoke with that rehabilitation facility I mentioned," he said casually. "They have an opening next week. I think we should seriously consider it. Next week seems soon, I replied carefully. The sooner we get you the specialized care you need, the better your long-term prospects, George said, his voice carrying fake concern. I've been doing research, and the statistics for home recovery versus professional rehabilitation are quite different. Statistics he was probably making up to pressure me into the facility where he could complete his theft and maintain permanent guardianship. What about the house? I asked. Oh, we'll keep it, of course, George lied smoothly. Though we might need to make some modifications, take out a loan against the equity to pay for your ongoing care. A loan that would never happen because he planned to sell the house entirely. That evening, after George left for the night, I lay in darkness planning my next moves. I had evidence of systematic theft, conspiracy, and planned guardianship fraud. I had nearly $1 billion in resources he didn't know about, and I had professional allies gathering additional evidence. But I also had a husband who was growing more desperate and suspicious by the day, and who was planning to have me institutionalized within a week. The race against time was accelerating, and I needed to be very careful about my next steps. George thought he was managing a helpless victim whose recovery was inconveniently faster than expected. He was actually being investigated by someone with unlimited resources and a growing understanding of just how deep his betrayal ran. The devoted husband was about to discover that stealing from the wrong woman could be a very expensive mistake. Sunday brought revelations that transformed my understanding of George's betrayal from opportunistic theft to something far more sinister. Dr. Patterson arrived for his weekend rounds with an unusual companion, a woman in a sharp business suit who introduced herself as Detective Lauren Walsh from the Financial Crimes Division. Mrs. Harrison, Dr. Patterson said carefully, Detective Walsh has some questions about your medical records, specifically about the circumstances of your accident. My blood turned cold. I'd been so focused on George's theft that I hadn't questioned the accident itself. A fall down our basement stairs while George was supposedly at the grocery store. A freak accident that had left me with severe spinal injuries requiring months of recovery. Mrs. Harrison, I want to be clear that this is a preliminary inquiry, Detective Walsh said, settling into the chair beside my bed. We've received information suggesting your husband may be involved in financial crimes against you. During our investigation, some inconsistencies came to light regarding your injury. What kind of inconsistencies? I managed to ask. Detective Walsh consulted her notes. The emergency room report indicates you fell down a full flight of basement stairs, resulting in compression fractures to your L2 and L3 vertebrae. However, the injury pattern doesn't match what we'd typically see from a fall. Dr. Patterson leaned forward. Belle, the fractures you sustained are more consistent with a direct impact to your lower back. The angle of compression suggests downward force rather than the rotational trauma we'd expect from tumbling downstairs. The room seemed to spin as the implication sank in. You think George pushed me? We're exploring all possibilities, Detective Walsh said diplomatically. Your husband reported finding you unconscious at the bottom of the stairs when he returned from shopping, but store security footage shows he was never at the grocery store that afternoon. I felt nauseous. The accident that had changed my life, that had left me vulnerable to George's theft. It hadn't been an accident at all. There's more, Detective Walsh continued. We've discovered that your husband took out a substantial life insurance policy on you just 6 months before your injury. $2 million, with him as the sole beneficiary. $2 million. George hadn't just been planning to steal our assets. He'd been planning for me to die. The basement stairs, the life insurance, the systematic theft while I recovered, it was all part of a comprehensive plan to eliminate me and take everything. The insurance application required a medical examination, Dr. Patterson added. The doctor who conducted it has no record of seeing you, despite George's claim that you passed the physical requirements. Another forgery. Another lie in what was apparently a years-long deception. Detective Walsh pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. "Do you recognize this man?" The image showed a tall, thin man with graying hair and an expensive suit. "No, I don't think so. His name is Marcus Thornfield. He's a private investigator your husband hired 8 months ago. Mr. Thornfield specializes in what he calls asset verification for wealthy individuals." My heart sank as I understood. He was investigating my family's finances. Specifically, he was looking into your great-aunt Millicent's estate. George apparently suspected you might be in line for an inheritance and wanted to confirm the details before proceeding with his plans. George had known. He'd known about the inheritance before he'd pushed me down those stairs. The timing wasn't coincidence. He'd been planning to kill me just as the money became available, making himself a widower who'd tragically lost his wife in an accident but inherited her fortune. "How much did he know?" I whispered. According to Mr. Thornfield's report, George was aware that the inheritance was substantial, in the hundreds of millions. What he didn't know was that it would be placed in a trust account with your name only, not accessible to spouses or beneficiaries. The irony was staggering. George had tried to murder me for money he wouldn't have been able to access anyway. His greed and impatience had turned him into a failed killer and a common thief. "Mrs. Harrison," Detective Walsh said gently, "we need to discuss your safety. If your husband realizes we're investigating him, or if he discovers you're aware of his activities, you could be in danger." I thought about George's increasing nervousness, his obsessive phone checking, his push to get me into the rehabilitation facility. "He's getting suspicious." "We believe so. The facility he's trying to place you in, Serenity Springs in Arizona, has had several investigations for patient abuse and questionable guardianship practices. Once you're there, it would be very difficult for anyone to verify your condition or communicate with you. It's the perfect place to make someone disappear," Dr. Patterson added grimly. Detective Walsh leaned forward. "Belle, we're prepared to offer you protection, but we need your cooperation. The evidence we have suggests attempted murder, insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. But to build a case that will put your husband away permanently, we need you to help us gather more evidence." "What kind of help?" "Controlled communication. Let him think you're unaware of his activities while we monitor his conversations and document his plans. It's risky, but it's the best way to catch him in the act." I thought about George's gentle kisses, his concerned expressions, his devoted husband performance, all while planning my death and stealing my money. The man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years had been my potential murderer all along. "He's coming back tonight," I said quietly. "He always comes back for evening visiting hours." "Then we'll be ready," Detective Walsh assured me. "You won't be alone in this, Belle. But you need to be very careful. We're dealing with someone who's already tried to kill you once." As they left to make preparations, I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The inheritance that was supposed to be my salvation had actually painted a target on my back. George hadn't married me for love. He'd married me for money he'd researched and planned to steal through murder. But he'd made one critical error. He'd failed to kill me properly. And now I had nearly $1 billion, a team of investigators, and an absolute determination to see him pay for everything he'd done. The attempted murderer was about to discover that his intended victim was very much alive and extremely dangerous. The decision to fight back crystallized that Sunday evening as I watched George perform his devoted husband routine for what I now knew was an audience of hidden police surveillance. Detective Walsh had arranged for monitoring equipment to be discreetly installed in my room, and 2 undercover officers were positioned as orderlies on my floor. George arrived precisely at 7 o'clock with a bouquet of daisies and his usual mask of concern. "How was your day, beautiful? You look more alert." "Better," I replied, forcing warmth into my voice while internally calculating every word. "Dr. Patterson says my strength is improving." Something flickered across George's face. Frustration? Perhaps, or impatience. That's wonderful, of course, though we shouldn't get our hopes up too high. Spinal injuries can be unpredictable. He was reminding me of my supposed limitations, trying to manage my expectations while pushing his agenda for the rehabilitation facility. But now I understood the true purpose of his words: psychological manipulation to keep me dependent and compliant. I've been thinking about what you said, I continued carefully, about the facility in Arizona. Maybe you're right that I need more specialized care. George's entire demeanor shifted, his relief almost palpable. Really? I'm so glad you're being realistic about this, Belle. I know it's hard to accept, but sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the long term. When would I go? Well, they have an opening this Wednesday, George said, trying to contain his eagerness. I know it seems fast, but these specialized facilities fill up quickly. We might not get another chance for months. Wednesday, 3 days from now. Detective Walsh had warned me that once I was in George's chosen facility, it would be nearly impossible to communicate with the outside world or document his activities. This was my window to gather evidence and build a case. What about our house? I asked, testing his reactions. Will we be able to afford both the facility and the mortgage? George's practiced expression of concern returned. Actually, Belle, I've been meaning to discuss this with you. Our insurance is covering most of the medical costs, but there are going to be ongoing expenses. Physical therapy, medications, specialized equipment. We might need to consider selling the house to ensure you get the best possible care. The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that if I hadn't seen the evidence of his real plans, I might have believed him. He wasn't selling the house for my care. He was selling it to pay off the debts he'd accumulated stealing from our accounts and to split the proceeds with Kirk. That seems like such a big decision, I said weakly. I know it's overwhelming, George replied, taking my hand with what appeared to be tenderness. That's why I think the facility will be perfect. You won't have to worry about any of these financial details. I'll handle everything. Handle everything. Meaning he'd complete his theft, sell our assets, and maintain guardianship over me indefinitely while I disappeared into a facility designed to keep patients isolated and controlled. George, I said, forcing vulnerability into my voice. I'm scared. About the future. About being so far from home. Oh, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. I know this is terrifying, but you have to trust me. I'm going to take care of everything. You'll never have to worry about money or decisions or any of that complicated stuff again. The patronizing tone made my skin crawl, but I nodded as if comforted. You've been so good to me through all this. That's what marriage means, George said. In sickness and in health, right? I made a promise to take care of you, and I intend to keep it. A promise he'd already broken the moment he pushed me down those stairs. My phone, which George controlled, buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it casually, then his expression changed to one of confusion and concern. That's odd, he said, showing me the screen. It's from someone at Meridian Bank asking about account verification. I've never heard of Meridian Bank. My heart raced, but I forced my expression to remain blank. Maybe it's spam? Maybe, George said, but his voice carried suspicion. Though it's strange they'd have your number. I watched him process this unexpected development, seeing the wheels turning behind his eyes. George was intelligent enough to recognize that Meridian Bank wasn't a random detail. It was a potential threat to his plans. I should probably call them tomorrow, he said carefully. Make sure someone isn't trying to use your identity for fraudulent accounts. That's probably smart, I agreed, though internally I was panicking. If George called Meridian Bank and discovered the inheritance account, everything would change. He'd know I had access to nearly $1 billion, and his plans would shift from managing a helpless victim to finding ways to access unlimited wealth. Belle, George said, his tone becoming more serious. Has anyone else been asking you about financial matters? Nurses, doctors, anyone official sounding? The question felt like a trap. I don't think so. Why? Just being cautious. Sometimes people try to take advantage of vulnerable patients. If anyone asks you about money or accounts or anything financial, you should let me handle it, okay? Okay, I said, understanding that. George was trying to maintain control over information flow while growing increasingly suspicious about outside interference. After he left that evening, I lay in darkness considering my options. The police surveillance would capture George's conversations and behavior, but I needed more evidence of his specific plans. The Meridian Bank text had made him nervous, which meant he'd be more cautious going forward. But I also had advantages George couldn't imagine. Nearly $1 billion in resources, a growing team of professional allies, and most importantly, the knowledge that his entire plan was built on lies and attempted murder. The rehabilitation facility transfer was scheduled for Wednesday. That gave me 3 days to gather enough evidence to destroy George's life the way he'd tried to destroy mine. I'd spent 8 years being the trusting wife. Now it was time to be the calculating strategist. The attempted murderer had no idea that his intended victim was about to become his worst nightmare. Monday morning brought the systematic unraveling of George's deceptions as Detective Walsh's team began sharing their forensic discoveries. Annette Morrison arrived early, carrying a briefcase that contained what she described as the most comprehensive fraud documentation I've seen in 20 years of practice. Belle, we need to discuss the scope of what we've uncovered, Annetta said, settling into the chair beside my bed. This goes far beyond simple theft. Your husband has been planning this for at least 2 years. She spread documents across the rolling table, each piece of paper representing another layer of George's betrayal. Bank records, insurance applications, real estate documents, and most damning of all, a detailed timeline that showed his systematic preparation for my elimination. The life insurance policy was just the beginning, Annette explained, pointing to a series of documents. 18 months ago, George quietly changed the beneficiaries on your retirement accounts, your investment portfolio, and even your health savings account. He used forged signatures on every single document. I studied the signatures, seeing now what I'd missed before. George had practiced my handwriting, improving his forgery skills over time. The early attempts were crude, but by the most recent documents, the signatures were nearly perfect replicas of my own. How did he get access to all these accounts? I asked. Professional help, Detective Walsh said, entering the room with a grim expression. We've identified at least 3 other people involved in this conspiracy. Kirk, obviously, but also Oscar, Chen from the bank, and a notary named Milo Rodriguez who's been providing fraudulent authentication for George's forged documents. Milo Rodriguez. I remembered George mentioning him occasionally, supposedly a family friend who helped with paperwork. In reality, he was part of a criminal network enabling identity theft and document fraud. The pattern shows sophisticated planning, Detective Walsh continued. George didn't just wake up one day and decide to steal from you. He's been methodically positioning himself to take control of your assets for years. Annette pulled out another set of documents. These are property records showing George's activities over the past 18 months. He's been quietly researching your family's real estate holdings, looking for additional assets he could claim after your death. My family's properties? Your parents' lake house that you inherited, the rental property in Denver that you've owned for 6 years, even the small warehouse your father left you. George has been conducting title searches and appraisals on everything. The scope of his investigation into my finances was staggering. George hadn't just been planning to steal our joint assets. He'd been cataloging every piece of property I owned, every investment I'd inherited, every financial resource he could potentially access. There's more, Detective Walsh said, consulting her notes. The private investigator, Marcus Thornfield, provided us with copies of his reports to George. The research into your great-aunt's estate was incredibly detailed. Financial statements, property holdings, investment portfolios. George knew almost as much about the inheritance as the estate lawyers did. But he couldn't have accessed it anyway, I said, confused. That's what makes this particularly disturbing, Annetta replied. The inheritance trust was specifically structured to prevent spousal access. Even if you had died, George wouldn't have been able to claim the money. He was planning to commit murder for assets he could never legally obtain. The futility of George's scheme made it even more horrifying. He'd been willing to kill me for money he'd never be able to touch, which suggested his motivation went beyond simple greed. There was something psychologically disturbed about his need to control and eliminate me. Detective Walsh, what about the accident itself? I asked. Do you have more evidence about what really happened? We do. She pulled out a tablet showing security footage. Your neighbor's doorbell camera captured George leaving your house at 2:47 p.m. the day of your accident. He told the emergency responders he'd been gone for about 20 minutes, but the timestamp shows he was inside for over 2 hours. 2 hours? Plenty of time to stage the scene, ensure you were unconscious but not dead, and then discover you at the bottom of the stairs. The medical evidence suggests you were unconscious from the initial impact, probably a blow to the head, before you were moved to the basement. I touched the back of my skull reflexively, remembering the headaches I'd experienced for weeks after the accident. George had struck me unconscious, then positioned my body at the bottom of the stairs to simulate a fall. The basement stairs themselves show evidence of staging. Detective Walsh continued. Scuff marks on the walls that don't match natural fall patterns, and a suspicious absence of your fingerprints on the handrail where someone falling would instinctively grab for support. Annette leaned forward. Belle, we're building a case for attempted murder, but we need to discuss your safety going forward. George is becoming increasingly suspicious, and if he realizes we're investigating him... What about Wednesday? I asked. The facility transfer? We can't let that happen, Detective Walsh said firmly. Once you're in Serenity Springs, it becomes much harder to protect you or gather evidence. The facility has a history of isolating patients from outside communication. So, what's our plan? We're going to use the next 2 days to gather enough evidence to arrest George before the transfer, Detective Walsh explained. But we need your help to keep him calm and unsuspecting while we work. Annette pulled out her phone. I've also been coordinating with your estate management team. The inheritance money needs to be protected and potentially used as evidence of George's motives. We're setting up additional security measures. What kind of security measures? Legal firewalls that make it impossible for anyone to access or freeze your inheritance accounts, even with fraudulent power of attorney documents. If George somehow discovers the money exists, he won't be able to touch it. As my team of allies prepared to leave, I felt a strange combination of empowerment and vulnerability. The evidence against George was overwhelming, but he was still free and still planning to institutionalize me in less than 48 hours. Belle, Detective Walsh said before departing, remember that George is dangerous. He's already tried to kill you once and he's facing decades in prison if we succeed. Don't take any unnecessary risks. After they left, I lay in my hospital, bed contemplating the systematic nature of George's betrayal. For years, he'd been researching my finances, forging my signatures, and planning my death while maintaining the perfect facade of a loving husband. But he'd made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed I was just another trusting victim who would never fight back. Now I had nearly $1 billion, a team of investigators, and 2 days to destroy the man who'd tried to destroy me. The devoted husband was about to learn that attempted murder could be a very expensive mistake. Monday evening brought the confession that shattered whatever remained of my faith in the man I'd married. George arrived for visiting hours earlier than usual, his demeanor more agitated than I'd seen since my accident. The hidden surveillance equipment would capture everything, but I wasn't prepared for the emotional devastation of hearing the complete truth. "Belle, we need to talk about something important," George said, settling into his chair with unusual tension. His phone had been ringing constantly throughout the day, and I could see the stress wearing on him. "What's wrong?" I asked, maintaining my facade of concerned wife. "I got a call from Meridian Bank today," he said, watching my face carefully. "They claim you have an account there with a significant balance. Do you know anything about this?" My heart raced, but I forced my expression to remain confused. "I've never heard of Meridian Bank. Maybe it's some kind of mistake?" George studied my face for a long moment, then seemed to relax slightly. "That's what I thought. But Belle, this made me realize we need to discuss something that's been weighing on me." He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot before continuing. "I haven't been completely honest with you about our financial situation." Here it was, the moment where George would reveal at least some portion of his deception. I braced myself for whatever version of the truth he was willing to share. "The medical bills, the rehabilitation costs, the modifications we'll need to make, they're much higher than I initially told you," George said, his voice carrying practiced regret. "I've been trying to protect you from the stress, but the reality is that we're going to go bankrupt if we don't make some difficult decisions." "How bad is it?" I whispered. George returned to his chair and took my hand. "Belle, I've had to make some financial moves that you might not understand. I've taken cash advances on our credit cards, borrowed against your retirement accounts, even put a second mortgage on the house. Some financial moves." He was confessing to theft while framing it as necessary sacrifice for my care. "I know it. Sounds terrible," George continued, "but I had to do whatever it took to keep you in this hospital, to pay for the specialists, to make sure you got the best possible treatment." The lies flowed so smoothly that I almost admired his skill. Every crime was reframed as an act of love. Every theft justified as medical necessity. "How much debt are we talking about?" I asked. "About $200,000, George said, his voice heavy with fake shame. "Maybe more. I haven't added everything up recently because it's too depressing." 200,000. He was admitting to less than half of what the forensic evidence had revealed, probably testing to see how I'd react to a partial confession. "George, that's everything we have," I said, allowing genuine distress to enter my voice. "I know, sweetheart. I know. That's why the facility in Arizona makes so much sense. They have payment plans, government assistance programs. We can work with them long-term instead of trying to handle everything ourselves." "But what about our house? Our savings?" George's expression grew more serious. "Belle, I need to tell you something else. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier." He paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever revelation was coming next. "I took out a life insurance policy on you last year," he said quietly. "A substantial one. I know it seems morbid, but with your health issues, I thought it was important to plan for every possibility. Health issues I hadn't had when he took out the policy. Health issues he'd created by pushing me down the stairs." "How substantial?" I asked. $2 million, George said, watching my reaction carefully. "I know it seems like a lot, but if something happened to you, I'd need resources to handle the debts, the funeral costs, everything. George, that's a lot of money. It is. And Belle, I need you to understand something." His voice became more intense, more emotional. "I would give anything to have you healthy and whole instead of having that money. The policy isn't something I want to collect on. It's just protection against the worst-case scenario." The worst-case scenario he'd actively tried to create. But then George's demeanor shifted again, becoming more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "Belle, there's something else, something I'm ashamed to admit." My stomach clenched as I sensed we were approaching the deeper truth. "When we first met at that charity auction 8 years ago," George said, his voice barely above a whisper, It wasn't entirely coincidence that I approached you. The charity auction. Our meet-cute story that I'd told friends and family dozens of times. The romantic beginning of our relationship. What do you mean? I had done some research beforehand, George said, unable to meet my eyes. About the attendees, about their backgrounds. You have to understand, I was working in banking. I understood wealth management, and I was looking for someone who would be a good partner for building a secure future. A good partner. He meant a wealthy target. I knew about your family's money, George continued. Your parents' estate, your inheritance potential, your job at Sterling Financial. I thought if I could build a relationship with someone financially stable, someone with good prospects. My vision blurred with tears as 8 years of memories rearranged themselves into a pattern of calculation and deception. So our entire relationship, I said slowly, our marriage, everything we built together, it was all planned? Not all of it, George said quickly. Belle, I did fall in love with you. I do love you. But I can't pretend that finances weren't part of my initial interest. Initial interest. As if love had grown from a foundation of financial predation. How much did you know? I asked. About my family's money? George was quiet for a long moment. More than I probably should have. I hired someone to do background research, not just on you, but on your family's assets, your inheritance prospects. I wanted to understand what I was getting into. He'd hired Marcus Thornfield years before my accident. Our entire courtship had been built on stolen financial information and calculated targeting. George, I whispered, did you marry me for money? I married you because I loved you, he said firmly. But I can't deny that your financial stability was attractive. Belle, I grew up poor, really poor. The idea of being with someone who could provide security, who came from wealth, it was appealing. As George continued his confession, revealing layer after layer of deception while trying to maintain that love had somehow been part of the equation, I understood finally that I'd never really known my husband at all. The man I'd trusted with my life, my heart, my future had been a stranger wearing a mask for 8 years. And now that stranger was planning to finish what he'd started in our basement. Tuesday morning transformed my hospital room into a covert command center as my growing team of allies converged to finalize our strategy. With less than 24 hours before George's planned transfer to the Arizona facility, every minute counted in our race to gather sufficient evidence for his arrest. Dr. Patterson arrived first, carrying medical files that would prove crucial to our case. Belle, I've documented every aspect of your recovery that contradicts George's claims about your mental capacity, he said, spreading charts across my bedside table. Your cognitive function, your physical progress, your ability to make informed decisions. It's all here in official medical records. The documentation would be essential for challenging any guardianship proceedings George might attempt to initiate. If he tried to have me declared mentally incompetent, Dr. Patterson's records would prove my full mental capacity at the time of his criminal activities. Detective Walsh entered with FBI agent Claire Morrison, Annette's colleague who specialized in interstate financial crimes. The involvement of federal authorities elevated the seriousness of our case and provided resources that local police couldn't access. Mrs. Harrison, we've made significant progress overnight, Agent Morrison said, settling into the chair beside my bed. The Financial Crimes Task Force has identified a pattern of similar cases involving your husband and his associates. Similar cases? George isn't a first-time offender, Detective Walsh explained. We've found evidence of at least 2 previous relationships where he targeted wealthy women, though none escalated to attempted murder. Agent Morrison pulled out a tablet showing photographs of 2 women. Patricia Kendall, a real estate investor from Portland, and Sandra Mitchell, who inherited a chain of boutique hotels. Both women reported suspicious financial activity after ending relationships with George, but neither pressed charges. The revelation that I wasn't George's first victim added another layer of horror to his crimes. He was a serial predator who had refined his methods over years of targeting vulnerable women. "What happened to them?" I asked. "Patricia lost about $50,000 before she discovered the theft and ended the relationship," Detective Walsh said. "Sandra was more fortunate. She caught him early and only lost about $15,000. Both women described the same pattern: intense courtship, quick progression to marriage or cohabitation, and then systematic financial infiltration. But with you, he escalated to attempted murder," Agent Morrison added grimly. "The difference was the inheritance investigation. When he learned about your great-aunt's estate, the stakes became too high for him to walk away." Annette Morrison arrived with her own reinforcements: a forensic accountant named Dr. Elena Rodriguez and a private investigator specializing in insurance fraud. My legal team was expanding to match the complexity of George's crimes. "Belle, we've traced every dollar George has stolen or attempted to access," Dr. Rodriguez said, opening her laptop to show detailed financial analysis. "The total approaches $300,000 when you include the credit card debt, the retirement account loans, and the planned house sale." "But that's not the most disturbing discovery," the private investigator, Marcus Webb, interjected. "George has been researching methods for accessing inheritance trusts that specify individual beneficiaries." My blood ran cold. What kind of methods? Legal challenges to trust documents, guardianship proceedings for mentally incapacitated beneficiaries, and in extreme cases, fraudulent death certificates to claim wrongful death settlements. Marcus Webb pulled out printed emails from George's personal account. These communications with a corrupt lawyer in Nevada show he was exploring options for gaining access to your inheritance even after the attempted murder failed. The scope of George's criminal planning was staggering. He hadn't just tried to kill me for the inheritance, he'd been researching backup plans to steal it even if I survived. "We need to discuss the immediate timeline," Detective Walsh said, consulting her notes. "George is expecting to transfer you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The transport vehicle from Serenity Springs is already confirmed." "What's our move?" I asked. Agent Morrison leaned forward. "We're going to let George believe the transfer is proceeding as planned. The transport will arrive, but instead of taking you to Arizona, it will be staffed by federal agents who will arrest George the moment he signs the transfer documents. Why wait until then? We need him to commit one final criminal act that we can capture with absolute certainty," Detective Walsh explained. "The transfer documents he'll sign contain false information about your mental capacity and financial situation. Signing them constitutes fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment." Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly. "And I'll be present to provide immediate medical testimony that contradicts every claim George makes about Belle's condition." Annette Morrison pulled out a thick legal document. "Belle, we also need to discuss protective measures for your inheritance. I've prepared paperwork that establishes a legal firewall around your assets, making it impossible for anyone to challenge your control over the money." "What kind of firewall?" "A irrevocable trust structure that you control completely, with backup. Trustees who are all independent professionals. Even if someone somehow obtained fraudulent power of attorney documents, they couldn't access these funds." As my team prepared for the final phase of our operation, I felt a strange combination of anticipation and sadness. Tomorrow would end. 8 years of marriage to a man I'd never really known. But it would also begin my transformation from victim to survivor. "Belle," Agent Morrison said as the meeting concluded, "I want you to understand that what we're doing tomorrow is dangerous. George is facing life in prison for attempted murder. If he realizes what's happening—" "I understand," I said firmly. "But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because I was too afraid to fight back." Dorothy Santos, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I just want you to know that every nurse on this floor is rooting for you. What he did, what he tried to do, it's unforgivable." As my allies departed to make final preparations, I lay in my hospital bed contemplating the next 24 hours. George would arrive tomorrow morning expecting to transfer a helpless victim to a facility where he could maintain permanent control over her life and assets. Instead, he would be walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that would end his criminal career forever. The devoted husband was about to discover that underestimating his wife had been the most expensive mistake of his life. Tomorrow, justice would finally be served with nearly $1 billion worth of resources backing it up. Tuesday. Afternoon brought the final pieces of evidence that would seal George's fate. While he made his last preparations for what he believed would be my permanent disappearance into the Arizona facility, my team conducted a methodical investigation that revealed the true depth of his criminal enterprise. Agent Morrison returned, with a laptop containing digital forensics that painted a comprehensive picture of George's deception. "Belle, we've gained access to George's personal devices through legal warrants," she said, opening files that showed months of incriminating evidence. "What we found goes beyond simple financial fraud." The screen displayed George's internet search history, and my stomach lurched as I read the entries. How to induce spinal injuries, basement stair accident statistics, life insurance claim procedures after accidental death, and most chilling, rehabilitation facilities with minimal family visitation policies. "He researched your accident," I whispered, the horror of his premeditation sinking in completely. "For over 6 months," Detective Walsh confirmed, joining us with additional evidence. "The digital forensics show he was planning your injury long before it happened." He studied medical literature about spinal compression fractures, researched recovery timelines, even looked up legal precedents for power of attorney decisions during extended medical incapacitation. Agent Morrison scrolled through more files. But the most damning evidence is his financial projections. George created detailed spreadsheets calculating exactly how much money he could access through various scenarios: your death, your permanent disability, or your institutionalization. She showed me a document titled Asset Recovery Timeline that made my blood run cold. George had calculated that my death would provide immediate access to $2 million in insurance, plus whatever he could steal before my estate was settled. My permanent disability would allow for longer-term theft, but with more risks. My institutionalization provided the perfect balance, extended access to assets with minimal oversight. He chose the basement stairs because of research he'd done about injury patterns, Detective Walsh explained. He found case studies showing that falls down wooden stairs frequently resulted in compression fractures that required extended recovery, but weren't typically fatal. He wanted me disabled, not dead? Initially, yes. The death would have been too obvious and triggered insurance investigations. A disabling accident gave him time to steal everything gradually while maintaining the devoted husband image. Dr. Rodriguez, the forensic accountant, spread additional documents across my bedside table. "Belle, we've also discovered that George has been systematically researching your family's financial history for over 3 years. He hired multiple private investigators, not just Marcus Thornfield." "Multiple investigators?" "At least 4 different firms," she confirmed. "Each one was asked to research different aspects of your family's wealth. One focused on real estate holdings, another on investment portfolios, a third on trust structures and inheritance laws. George wanted to understand every possible source of money he might eventually access." Agent Morrison pulled up another file. "The inheritance investigation was particularly thorough. George knew about your great-aunt Millicent's wealth almost 2 years before she died. He'd been monitoring her health, her business activities, even her will updates through contacts at various law firms." "How is that legal?" "It's not," Detective Walsh said grimly. "We've identified at least 6 different privacy violations and potentially criminal breaches of confidential information. George built a network of corrupt professionals who provided insider information for payment. The scope of George's criminal enterprise was staggering. He hadn't just been a husband planning to steal from his wife. He'd been operating what amounted to a financial intelligence network focused on exploiting my family's wealth. "There's more," Dr. Rodriguez said, opening her laptop to show Banky. "Records. We've traced George's activities to at least 12 other potential victims over the past 5 years. Women he researched but never approached, presumably because their financial profiles didn't meet his criteria. 12 other women. He was running what we call a target assessment operation," Agent Morrison explained. "Systematically researching wealthy women in our area, evaluating their vulnerability, their family relationships, their financial sophistication. You weren't randomly chosen, Belle. You were selected from a list of potential victims." Detective Walsh showed me printed emails between George and Kirk that revealed the depth of their conspiracy. "Your brother-in-law wasn't just helping with the theft," she said. "He was actively participating in the victim research. These emails show him providing information about women he met through his work in real estate. Kirk had been using his access to property records and client information to identify wealthy women for George to target. Their criminal partnership had been operating for years before George had even met me." "The most disturbing discovery," Agent Morrison continued, "is evidence that George was already researching his next potential victim while planning your institutionalization." She showed me a file labeled Post-Arizona Planning that contained research on 3 different women, including detailed financial profiles and vulnerability assessments. "He was planning to leave me in the facility and find someone else to target?" "Eventually, yes. The documents suggest he saw the Arizona facility as a long-term storage solution for you while he pursued other opportunities." Storage solution. George had been planning to warehouse me like an inconvenient object while he moved on to destroy other women's lives. As my team continued revealing the evidence they'd gathered, I felt a strange detachment from the horror of George's crimes. The systematic nature of his deception was so extensive that it almost seemed surreal, like reading about a fictional criminal rather than my husband of 8 years. "Belle," Detective Walsh said gently, "I know this is overwhelming. The level of planning and manipulation is extraordinary, even for someone with my experience in financial crimes. What happens tomorrow?" I asked. "Tomorrow, we end his operation permanently," Agent Morrison said with quiet determination. "George Harrison will never target another victim again." As my allies prepared for the final confrontation, I lay in my hospital bed contemplating the man I'd married. George hadn't just been stealing money, or even planning murder. He'd been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that treated women's lives as business opportunities. But he'd made one critical error in his calculations. He'd underestimated the woman he'd chosen as his victim. Tomorrow, the systematic predator would discover that his intended victim had become his executioner. Tuesday evening brought the arrival of the final authority figures who would validate our case and ensure George's crimes received appropriate consequences. Judge Helena Morrison, Annette's former law school colleague, arrived with court orders that would protect me legally and financially during the upcoming confrontation. "Belle, I've reviewed the evidence your team has compiled," Judge Morrison said, settling into the chair beside my bed with a briefcase full of legal documents. "I'm prepared to issue emergency protective orders that will freeze all assets George has accessed fraudulently and prevent any further financial manipulation." The judge's involvement lent official weight to our operation. With court orders backing our actions, George wouldn't be able to claim later that his arrest was procedurally flawed or that his rights had been violated. I'm also authorizing a temporary restraining order that prevents George from making any medical decisions on your behalf. Judge Morrison continued. Your power of attorney documents are being officially revoked as of this moment, given the evidence of fraud and coercion. Agent Morrison entered with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a federal forensic psychiatrist who would provide expert testimony about George's psychological profile and the systematic nature of his crimes. Mrs. Harrison, I've reviewed the evidence of your husband's behavior patterns. Dr. Chen said, consulting her tablet. What we're seeing is consistent with someone who has antisocial personality disorder with specific predatory tendencies toward wealthy women. Meaning? George exhibits classic characteristics of a psychopathic predator who views relationships as business transactions, Dr. Chen explained. His ability to maintain the devoted husband persona while planning your murder shows an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization and emotional manipulation. Detective Walsh joined our group with final confirmation from the district attorney's office. Belle, the DA has agreed to pursue federal charges under the RICO Act. George's operation meets the criteria for organized criminal enterprise. RICO charges meant George would face decades in federal prison rather than the lighter sentences typical for individual fraud cases. His criminal network would be dismantled completely, protecting future potential victims. What about Kirk and the others? I asked. Kirk Harrison faces conspiracy charges, as does Oscar Chen from the bank and Milo Rodriguez, the notary, Agent Morrison confirmed. We're also investigating the private investigators and lawyers who provided confidential information. This is going to be a comprehensive prosecution. Judge Morrison pulled out additional documents. Belle, I'm also approving the establishment of your protective trust structure. Your inheritance will be completely shielded from any legal challenges, current or future. As my legal team finalized preparations for tomorrow's confrontation, Dr. Patterson arrived with discharge papers that would allow me to leave the hospital immediately after George's arrest. Your physical recovery has been remarkable, Dr. Patterson said. You'll need continued physical therapy, but there's no medical reason to keep you hospitalized. The irony wasn't lost on me. George had been planning to institutionalize me based on false claims about my inability to care for myself, while my actual medical team was clearing me for independent living. Belle, Judge Morrison said as the meeting concluded, tomorrow marks the end of George's criminal operation and the beginning of your complete freedom. You'll have legal protection, financial security, and most importantly, justice. As my team departed, I felt the weight of institutional authority behind our mission. George wasn't just facing arrest by local police. He was confronting the full power of federal law enforcement, the court system, and medical professionals united in stopping his criminal enterprise. Tomorrow, the systematic predator would discover that his victim had assembled an army of professionals committed to his destruction. Wednesday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation. At 6 a.m., while George was presumably making his final preparations for what he believed would be my permanent institutionalization, my team assembled in the family conference room to coordinate the day's events. Agent Morrison spread a detailed timeline across the table. George expects the transport vehicle at 9 a.m. sharp. He's confirmed the pickup time twice with the facility, and his credit card shows he's already paid for the first month's fees. Detective Walsh pointed to surveillance photos taken outside my hospital. Kirk arrived at 7:30 and is waiting in the parking garage. Oscar Chen is scheduled to arrive at 8:45 to provide financial documentation for the transfer. The timing was perfect. George had unknowingly assembled all his co-conspirators in one location at the exact moment we needed them for arrests. The transport vehicle will arrive on schedule, Agent Morrison continued, but it will be staffed with federal agents posing as medical transfer personnel. George won't realize anything is wrong until the moment he signs the fraudulent transfer. Documents. Dr. Patterson reviewed his role in the operation. I'll be present to provide immediate medical testimony contradicting every claim George makes about Belle's condition. The moment he signs papers stating she's mentally incapacitated, I'll have documented proof that he's committing fraud. Annette Morrison confirmed the legal timing. Judge Morrison is standing by with sealed warrants. The moment George commits the transfer fraud, she'll authorize the full asset seizure and criminal proceedings. Dorothy Santos, who had been instrumental in gathering early evidence, would serve as a witness to George's behavior patterns over the past weeks. I've documented every conversation, every lie he's told about your condition, she assured me. The jury will hear exactly how manipulative he's been. At 8:15 a.m., I was moved to a private room where I could observe the hospital's main entrance without being seen. From my vantage point, I watched George arrive carrying a small suitcase, presumably packed with my belongings for the facility. His demeanor was confident, almost cheerful. He believed he was minutes away from permanently disposing of an inconvenient wife while gaining access to substantial assets. The sight of his satisfaction made my stomach turn, but also strengthened my resolve. "Belle," Agent Morrison said through her earpiece, "we need you to maintain the Helpless Patient Act until the very last moment. George cannot suspect anything until the handcuffs are on." At 8:45 a.m., I watched Oscar Chen enter the hospital carrying a briefcase full of fraudulent financial documents. Kirk's car was visible in the parking garage, positioned for what he probably thought would be a quick escape after the successful transfer. The three co-conspirators had gathered exactly as predicted, each believing they were about to complete a profitable criminal operation. At 8:55 a.m., a white medical transport van pulled up to the hospital's main entrance. To anyone watching, it appeared to be exactly what George had arranged. Only my team knew that the vehicle contained federal agents prepared to end George's criminal career. "This is it," Detective Walsh announced. "All units are in position." As I watched George approach the transport vehicle with confident satisfaction, I felt a cold sense of completion. The man who had systematically planned my destruction was walking directly into the trap that would destroy him instead. The devoted husband was about to discover that his victim had orchestrated his perfect downfall. Justice was exactly 5 minutes away. At exactly 9 a.m., George Harrison walked confidently toward what he believed was his final victory, carrying transfer documents that would institutionalize his wife and complete his access to her assets. Instead, he walked directly into the most carefully orchestrated takedown in the history of federal financial crimes. I watched from my hidden vantage point as George approached the transport vehicle, his expression radiating satisfaction. He shook hands with Agent Morrison, who was disguised as the facility's transport coordinator, completely unaware that he was greeting the federal agent who had been building a case against him for days. "Mr. Harrison," Agent Morrison said professionally, "we'll need you to review and sign the transfer documentation before we can proceed." George eagerly accepted the clipboard, scanning documents that appeared to authorize my transfer to Serenity. Springs but actually contained false statements about my mental capacity, fraudulent financial information, and unlawful medical claims. "Everything looks perfect," George said, signing his name with a flourish. "My wife really needs this specialized care." The moment his signature completed the final document, Agent Morrison's demeanor shifted completely. "George Harrison, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and violation of federal RICO statutes." George's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion, disbelief, then pure panic as Agent Morrison displayed. Her FBI credentials and federal agents emerged from the transport vehicle. "What? There must be some mistake," George stammered, looking around desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. "Kirk Harrison, you're also under arrest," Detective Walsh announced, approaching from the parking garage where Kirk had been waiting. Kirk's attempt to flee was cut short by additional agents who had surrounded his vehicle. Inside the hospital, Oscar Chen was simultaneously arrested as he waited in the lobby with his briefcase full of fraudulent documents. The coordinated takedown ensured that no member of George's criminal network could escape or destroy evidence. "Mr. Harrison," Agent Morrison continued as handcuffs were applied, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." George's eyes darted frantically around the scene, finally understanding that his carefully planned operation had been completely compromised. "Belle can't. She's not capable of. This is impossible." "Your wife is fully competent and has been cooperating with federal investigators for the past week," Detective Walsh informed him. "She's been aware of your theft, your conspiracy, and your attempted murder from the beginning. The moment George realized that his helpless victim had orchestrated his downfall was captured perfectly by surveillance cameras. His expression shifted, from panic to complete devastation, as he understood that Belle had outmaneuvered him entirely. As the arrest proceeded, Dr. Patterson emerged from the hospital with my medical records. "Mr. Harrison, for the record, your wife has shown remarkable recovery and has been mentally competent throughout her hospitalization. Every claim you've made about her condition has been medically false." George was loaded into the federal transport vehicle, the same one he'd believed would carry away his inconvenient wife. Instead, it carried him toward a federal detention center where he would await trial for crimes that could result in life imprisonment. Kirk and Oscar Chen were arrested separately, their shock and confusion evident as they realized their lucrative conspiracy had been thoroughly investigated and documented. As the vehicles departed, I finally emerged from my hiding place, walking steadily with only a slight limp from my recovery. The woman George had tried to murder and institutionalize stood watching his arrest with nearly $1 billion in assets and a team of federal agents ensuring justice would be served. The devoted husband had discovered that underestimating his wife was the most expensive mistake he would ever make. The immediate aftermath of the arrests brought a cascade of consequences that George and his associates had never imagined possible. Within hours of their detention, the full scope of their criminal network began unraveling as federal investigators executed search warrants across multiple locations. Agent Morrison contacted me at the hospital with updates that revealed just how thoroughly we had destroyed George's operation. "Belle, the search of your house has uncovered evidence that goes far beyond what we initially discovered. George had an entire room dedicated to researching potential victims. The basement office that George had claimed was for managing our finances actually contained files on dozens of women, complete with photographs, financial assessments, and vulnerability analyses. His home office had been the headquarters of a systematic predatory operation targeting wealthy women across 3 states. We found printed emails with contacts in Arizona, Nevada, and California," Agent Morrison continued. "George was coordinating with accomplices in multiple jurisdictions to identify and research potential victims. This wasn't just a local operation. It was an interstate criminal enterprise." Detective Walsh arrived with even more disturbing news. Kirk's apartment contained forged documents with at least 12 different women's signatures. He was practicing identity theft on multiple targets simultaneously. The scope of crimes committed by George's network was staggering. They hadn't just been planning to victimize me, they had been operating what amounted to a criminal corporation, specializing in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable, wealthy women. "Oscar Chen's office at the bank has been sealed," Agent Morrison reported. "Internal audit is discovering that he provided confidential financial information on hundreds of customers to George over the past 3 years. The bank is facing potential federal sanctions for the security breaches." My phone rang with a call from Annette Morrison, who had news about the immediate legal consequences. "Belle, I've just spoken with the federal prosecutor. George is being denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of charges. The attempted murder charge alone carries a potential life sentence." "What about Kirk and Oscar?" "Kirk is facing 25 years minimum under RICO statutes. Oscar Chen is looking at 15 years plus disbarment from the banking industry. None of them are getting out anytime soon." The financial consequences were equally severe. Judge Morrison had authorized the immediate seizure of all assets George had fraudulently accessed, including the money he'd transferred to offshore accounts and the cash he'd distributed to Kirk. "We've recovered approximately $280,000 of the $300,000 he stole," Annette reported. "The remaining amount was spent on his criminal operation, payments to private investigators, bribes to corrupt officials, and funding for the criminal network." Dr. Patterson arrived with my final discharge papers and news that made George's situation even worse. "Belle, I've been contacted by 3 other hospitals where George made inquiries about accident-prone wives over the past 2 years. He was researching other potential victims while married to you. The revelation that George had been planning additional murders while we were married added another layer of horror to his crimes. He hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had been actively researching ways to kill other women while sharing my bed. As I prepared to leave the hospital and begin my new life, Agent Morrison provided one final update that brought complete satisfaction. George asked for a lawyer and tried to negotiate a plea deal, she said with a slight smile. His attorney took one look at the evidence and advised him that no deal was possible. He's going to trial, and with the evidence we have, conviction is virtually certain. The man who had systematically planned my destruction now faced the complete destruction of his own life, with no possibility of escape or redemption. Justice was not just being served, it was being delivered with interest. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching George Harrison receive a sentence that would ensure he never harmed another woman again. Judge Helena Morrison presided over the hearing that brought complete closure to the most comprehensive financial crimes prosecution in the district's history. Mr. Harrison, Judge Morrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute justice. You have been found guilty on 17 federal counts, including attempted murder, conspiracy under RICO statutes, identity theft, mail fraud, and interstate financial crimes. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. George's face showed no emotion as the sentence was delivered. The confident, manipulative man who had systematically planned my destruction had been replaced by a hollow shell who understood that his criminal career had cost him everything. Kirk Harrison received 28 years in federal prison, while Oscar Chen was sentenced to 18 years plus permanent disbarment from the financial services industry. Milo Rodriguez, the corrupt notary, received 12 years. The entire criminal network had been dismantled and punished with sentences that reflected the severity of their systematic crimes. During the trial, 7 additional women had come forward with evidence that George's network had targeted them for research or preliminary fraud attempts. The prosecution had presented a comprehensive case showing that George's operation represented one of the most sophisticated financial predation schemes ever prosecuted under federal law. Agent Morrison approached me as the courtroom cleared. Belle, I wanted you to know that this case will be used as a training example for financial crimes investigators nationwide. The evidence you helped gather and the coordination between agencies created a template for prosecuting similar operations. The financial resolution had been equally comprehensive. The court ordered complete restitution of all stolen funds, plus additional damages that brought my recovery to nearly $400,000 beyond what had been taken. The proceeds from the sale of George's assets, including his share of our house, would fund a victim assistance program for financial fraud survivors. Dr. Patterson had provided compelling testimony about George's psychological manipulation and the medical evidence proving his attempted murder. His expert testimony had been crucial in securing the attempted murder conviction that carried the life sentence. Most importantly, the investigation had led to the identification and protection of 12 women who had been researched as potential future victims. George's files contained detailed plans for targeting these women, plans that would never be implemented thanks to his permanent incarceration. As I left the courthouse, Annette Morrison walked beside me carrying documents that finalized the last legal aspects of my case. Belle, your inheritance protection trust is now completely secure. No future legal challenges can touch those assets, and you have full control over how the money is used. The $847 million inheritance that had originally made me a target for murder had instead become the resource that funded the most thorough investigation and prosecution of a financial predator in federal history. George's greed had led him to target the wrong woman, someone with unlimited resources and an absolute determination to seek justice. That evening, I stood in my new home, a secure property purchased with inheritance funds and protected by state-of-the-art security systems, reflecting on the transformation from victim to victor. The quiet accountant George had married for her family's money had become an advocate for financial crime victims and a symbol of how wealth could be used to seek justice rather than enable corruption. George Harrison would spend the rest of his life in prison, while I would spend the rest of mine ensuring that other women received the protection and resources they needed to fight back against similar predators. Justice had been served with compound interest. 1 year after George's sentencing, I stood before a congressional committee presenting legislation that would protect vulnerable adults from the systematic financial predation that had nearly destroyed my life. The Harrison Financial Protection Act, named for the case that had exposed the gaps in current law, would create federal standards for investigating suspected financial abuse and provide resources for victims to fight back. Distinguished members of Congress, I addressed the committee. My husband's attempt to murder me for inheritance money revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated undetected for years. The legislation before you today will ensure that future victims have the resources and legal protections they need to seek justice. The foundation I had established with inheritance funds, the Millicent Harrison Institute for Financial Justice, had already helped 17 women escape similar situations and prosecute the predators who had targeted them. Our legal defense fund, staffed by attorneys who specialized in financial crimes, provided free representation for victims who couldn't afford to fight back against sophisticated criminals. Agent Morrison, who had become the Institute's Director of Investigations, approached me after the hearing. Belle, we've just received authorization to expand our program to 12 additional states. The FBI is adopting our investigation protocols as standard procedure for financial predation cases. What had begun as my personal quest for justice had evolved into a national movement protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. The nearly billion-dollar inheritance that George had tried to steal through murder was now funding a comprehensive defense network for potential victims across the country. Dr. Patterson joined our team as medical director, developing protocols for healthcare providers to recognize signs of financial abuse in patients. Dorothy Santos had become our victim advocate coordinator, using her nursing experience to help survivors navigate the complex process of reporting and prosecuting financial crimes. That evening, I returned to my secure home and opened a letter from Patricia Kendall, one of George's earlier victims who had testified at his trial. Belle, she wrote, knowing that George will never hurt another woman has given me peace I didn't think was possible. Thank you for having the courage and resources to fight back when I couldn't. As I prepared for bed, I looked at the framed photograph Dorothy had given me, the image of myself in the hospital bed with my laptop, determination clear on my face despite my physical vulnerability. The woman in that photograph had been fighting for her life and her future. Now she was fighting for every woman who might face similar predators. George Harrison had tried to eliminate me for money he could never legally access. Instead, he had created an advocate with unlimited resources and an absolute commitment to ensuring that financial predators faced the full consequences of their crimes. The quiet accountant he had married for her inheritance had become his worst nightmare. A woman with nearly $1 billion dedicated to destroying men exactly like him. Justice had not only been served, it had been weaponized for the protection of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.